Hi, everyone. The next session is by Claire and Shamila, who will be sharing about lessons learned from a building footprint input. So both of you, if you could take it away. If you have any questions, feel free to post them on the comment section and then they'll be answered afterwards.
Hello, bonjour. So this talk is given by my colleague Shamila, located in Uganda, and myself, Claire, in the DRC. Hello. So from Shamila, can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay. Yes. Thank you. So so this is from mid 2020 to up to now, actually, dozens of mappers in both Uganda and the DRC have joined a participatory buildings footprint import. A number of them are actually participating to this conference, so I welcome them too. The data of these buildings footprints had been produced by Ecopia, which is a company based on an imagery mosaic that was provided by Maxar and contained more than 6 million buildings footprints. And so during this session, we are going to explain what worked well and less well, and what we learned. I mean, we learned a lot from the process of integrating this data into the OpenStreetMap database. And this whole initiative was part of a project called Scaling Missing Maps in the African Great Lakes region to support public health staff in Eastern DRC and in Western Uganda. And yeah, I'm gonna give the the mic to Shamila to pursue with the explanation of how we did that.
Thank you, Claire. So with this process, we had a strict workflow and the detailed workflow that was live on the wiki, that was detailing and explaining to mappers how we actually, the different steps we had to follow. So we had to compare the AI generated buildings and the pre-existing OSM buildings that were already in OSM. And for this process, we utilize tools like, we use JOSM for this process, and we use the conflation tool, which was the main star of this event. Just to make sure that, trying to make sure that this plays. So with this, the process usually just involves trying to merge. The conflation is literally just merging the AI generated buildings and what you find in OpenStreetMap. My colleague Claire is going to take us through some of the lessons. We're going to discuss some of the lessons that we picked from this exercise and what went well, what did not go well, and what we hope to improve in case someone else is to replicate the similar exercise. Yes, over to you, Claire. Sorry. Okay, I'll take it on. So our first hypothesis was,
Sorry,
okay.
it was my mic.
All right.
Apologize. So first, why did we want to do this? So we started with thinking of uploading these buildings in order to serve as a proxy to identify places where people were living. This to know which were the places for which we would need to collect names on the ground and where were data gaps. And the hypothesis of doing this through a buildings import with building footprints extracted in an automated way for a wide area was to get a process that would be much faster than tracing every building manually from the satellite imagery, as it is often done through mapathons, and potentially, hopefully, generating cleaner data, because there could be automatic checks to make sure that the buildings were either rounded or orthogonalized, and so therefore we were hoping for buildings that would have proper tags and proper geometry before being imported. So that was our hypothesis. Then we started learning. So our first lessons learned was that the more existing objects there are, the more time consuming the conflation becomes. So what's the conflation? Maybe over to you, Shami.
Yes, the conflation was mainly to combine or merge what we got from the AI trust buildings and what we already had in OpenStreetMap. So with this, we noticed that it was a bit more time consuming if you are trying to merge information or trying to map a place that already has data. For instance, like people maybe had already mapped that place. So in this case, you'd actually find that you would have to try to choose between either the AI generated building or what you've found in OpenStreetMap. On the brighter side, though, we realized that this actually helped us because the AI generated buildings were a bit more accurate, maybe in geometry. So we would maybe keep the geometry, but also maintain the merging would allowed us to keep the history of the buildings that were already present in OpenStreetMap. But this became time consuming because of that comparison. And we noticed it was also a bit much faster in places that previously had not been mapped, because in this case, you would just take the AI generated buildings and check that they were okay, then proceed to upload to OpenStreetMap.
Yeah. The lesson number 2 was that import actually required extensive training. And so it is much more time consuming to learn how to proceed with an import as this one, than to learn how to add buildings, tracing them manually from Imagery. And when this buildings import started, we were at most people were still locked down, and we didn't have any opportunity to do in-person trainings, which means that training remotely through such a complex process, relatively, the mappers that were spread over the cities and countries revealed, to be like quite complex and much less effective. Over to you, Shami.
The other thing we noticed that despite the fact that we were using AI generated buildings for this importation process, we also noticed that there were false positives. So where mappers would usually find, let's say someone maybe maps an anthill as a building, we also found some of these. And also, so these, in this case, the mappers would actually have to choose, either to use that building or to drop it and just either trace manually in case they found another one, or utilize it. So this was also a challenge that we found. So it's not all automatic. You would still need input from the mapper to utilize and use this data. Lesson number 4, over to you, Claire.
The OpenStreetMap community expectations are, I would say, higher for imports than for manual tracing. For object imports, there are some guidelines which are described on the wiki, and so we followed them as much as we could. But then, in terms of quality mapping, the OSM community doesn't want data that would be of a lesser good quality just because it's coming from an import. That's obvious. But sometimes a computer, when doing automated extraction, will make mistakes that a person wouldn't do. And so it's really required to go through each and every building to be checked. And sometimes a mapper gets tired of it and might get faster. And this will be matched and spotted by other people too. And so we were doing our best to check this, but that also conducted. provoked lots of interesting discussions with other mappers in the community and about like the added value of such a building's import. Over to you, Shami.
Yes, and then the other thing we also noticed that it was crucial to make sure that the satellite imagery that we were using for this was made public to all contributors. So this would allow openness in the exercise, and everyone can actually have access to the reference imagery that we're using to add these buildings, and also provide some external validation. Then we also noticed that the imagery offsets were usually not sufficient enough to align objects, because you find that different objects are added to OpenStreetMap, maybe basing on different imagery, especially for remote mapping. So with this, and then you also have like there's a constant update of imagery that is available to mappers. So it was a bit challenging to choose which offset we had to use to align the AI generated buildings, and also find what imagery was used to map the previous buildings that we actually found present in OSM. For this, we actually ended up, we actually ended up trying to use either both buildings and roads to align the imagery. Yes,
yeah. And so on this subject of imagery offsets, so we are used to correct and request mappers that are working in areas where all objects seems to be shifted compared to the imagery, to first start by offsetting the imagery that they want to use and to align it with the existing objects. But what appeared in the area, which is very hilly and where there's probably not many good quality geodetic data, was that when we are doing offsetting, I mean, adjusting the imagery based on an offset, we are making a 2D correction, while there's a third dimension, which is also distorted. And this third dimension, when we are receiving the mosaic from the imagery provider, we are not anymore able to properly correct it without, I mean, collecting control points on the ground and this kind of things, which wouldn't be possible in such a context. But therefore, it is even more necessary that everyone has access to this imagery, because this kind of distortions can change the relative distance between different objects and let other mappers think that you haven't properly done your mapping while you did it in a following accurately the imagery, but others should also be able to access this imagery and understand how the buildings are actually located.
Yes, so true.
The lessons learned number 7 was that contributing to a building's footprint report is not really like mapping buildings from scratch, but it's actually some kind of a validation of the automated buildings extraction. And so it requires validation skills and taking some distance from the data that has been built to assess it and to be able to clean it before adding it or comparing it with the existing data. Over to you.
I think the major lesson was really understanding that when you're updating existing buildings, it involves deleting maybe in case some buildings are no longer present on the imagery. So we ended up having back-to-back discussions with like the community members on, maybe you guys are deleting so many buildings, yet they no longer exist on ground in the imagery that we're using, which was more updated. So I think this is actually a discussion the OpenStreetMap community needs to have on how to handle updating the data that we have in OSM.
Extracting buildings from the imagery can effectively be much faster than extracting them from satellite imagery in a manual way. This will be true on the company side. So if they have all the imagery and they have the algorithm configured and adapted to the area of concern, they can effectively extract buildings from imagery much faster than we can trace them. But actually importing these buildings properly into OSM proved to be a much slower process. Despite the buildings to be relatively good quality compared to existing standards, but that was really like what we thought would be much more easier became a bottleneck, and therefore like adjusting and adapting this data into the OSM database is a step that really needs some more thinking.
Yes.
Shami, go.
No, over to you, Claire, to wrap up, and we go into the questions from our participants.
So in this same line, so that brought us to the reflection that if the mapping and all the buildings that we are adding today are actually making tomorrow's mapping much more complex, what is actually the added value of adding that many objects today? Should it be a goal in itself, or should we just wait to have better data to be added, or should we work on tools to be able to better conflate much bigger quantities of data in the future? And we wanted to have some time to exchange with the participants. So if you have any questions and or comments or recommendations, over to you.
Thank you, Claire and Shamila, for sharing with us. That was quite insightful. From our audience, we have not received any questions, but I can ask a general one. So for a community or an organization who's interested in doing an import, like what are the first steps to consider? And are there any online resources that people can check out regarding conducting imports and all that's needed to be done? Either of you can take it.
Yes, I can go first and maybe Claire will add. I think one would be obviously learning from people that have previously done like the same import. So usually have import processes documented on the wiki. So you can always go to this for a reference and find out like the different steps that were followed and what you can adjust and tweak to your own process as well. Claire, any additions?
I'm sorry, my connection was broken. I haven't got the question.
I was just asking if there are any online resources that people can check out regarding imports and the process that's needed.
Talking a lot with the community and like thinking about what that data is going to be used for is, I think, a really sensitive point. And we should not have numbers to be our first goal.
Okay, then I guess we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much again, Shamila and Claire, for quite an insightful presentation, and also just to share a comment by Ilya, who says that it's very rare to see an importing project that actually listened to the community and really says that that was a great job. Same from Rebecca, who has shared that what you've shared are excellent learnings, and she's learned a lot from this talk. And as well, someone has shared import guidelines that are on the wiki page, and you can also find more information on previous imports that have been done. So feel free to check that link. So thanks again, Claire and Shami. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.